David, a 10-year-old boy, loved helping his parents with household chores, as well as assisting his teacher and classmates at school. His family didn't have much money, but they made sure he was enrolled in the best school in the neighborhood. Everything changed after he saw a thin, dirty man on the street and offer him a sandwich, the lunch his mother had lovingly prepared. Days later, the police knocked on their door, and nothing was the same after that. In a small and modest home, John and Brenda lived with their son, David. It was a humble one-bedroom apartment, with each room just big enough to serve its purpose. The only bedroom was reserved for David, while his parents slept on a sofa bed in the living room. Despite living simply, the family was happy and loving. John was an engineer who had lost his job and was now working as a driver while searching for employment in his field. Brenda was a caregiver for the elderly and served 3 different families. It was common for the couple to work from Sunday to Sunday, and even overnight. When the parents were away for work, David would stay with one of his grandmothers who lived in nearby neighborhoods. Seeing his parents always busy, David learned early on the importance of helping his family. Even at a young age, he took care of his school supplies, washed his dishes, and folded his clothes, which filled his parents with pride and allowed them more time to rest from their exhausting routine. At school, David also helped his teacher and classmates whenever he could. He helped arrange the classroom and erase the board. When a classmate had trouble, he made sure to be the first to help. Even during playtime, David was helpful. If no one wanted to be the goalie during soccer games, he would volunteer without a second thought, even though he loved scoring goals. At the school gate, other parents asked John and Brenda how they managed to raise such a well-behaved child. Flattered, the couple would reply, "We just give him love and discipline. And of course, we set an example." In the same class as David was Henry, a troublemaker who ended up in the principal's office at least once a week for some prank. When Henry asked to borrow a colored pencil, no one wanted to lend him one, but David did. Later, Henry didn't want to return it. The other kids told David to go straight to the principal, saying that would solve everything. Instead, David talked to Henry and said he would lend his pencils every day as long as Henry returned them, and that he wouldn't tell the teacher or anyone else because he trusted Henry. Surprised to be treated kindly by a classmate for the first time, Henry agreed, and gradually, with David's influence, his visits to the principal's office became less frequent until they were a thing of the past. Despite working tirelessly, David's parents made an effort to find time to spend with him, whenever one of them could, rarely both at the same time, which only happened on birthdays and Christmas. They took turns taking David to the park or for an ice cream, the most they could afford. They tried hard to ensure that their son didn't notice they were struggling financially. David, though young, noticed that his parents worked more and more, and the fridge was getting emptier, but he didn't complain because he knew his parents always did the right thing and solved every problem. They were his inspiration to always do his best at home and at school. When his parents were away, David played with his friends on the street. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, a rarity these days. The children could play in the park, and there were always adults nearby, from the residents to the doormen of the buildings and workers at the bakery, the convenience store, and the restaurant on the street, who knew each other and each of the children. The biggest problem they might face was a scraped knee, a frequent but minor issue compared to the world's bigger problems. What mattered was that everyone took pride in offering the children a safe and fun childhood that everyone should have. The park had a slide, swings, a jungle gym, seesaw, and an open field for the children to run around in, which was usually used for soccer games. Even without goals, the children used flip-flops to mark the goalposts. The game's rules changed almost every day, along with the number of players. Sometimes 3 on each team, sometimes 6 or even 7, filling the field with kids. When they weren't kicking the ball around, they played tag or hot potato. Then on a Sunday morning, there was someone different in the park. The kids arrived early to play, and instead of spreading out on the playground, they all gathered in a corner. On the other side, sitting on a bench, was a different adult. His shirt, which had once been white, was now stained and worn. His pants were torn at the ankles. His feet were bare and scarred. His beard and hair were gray, and none of the children could tell if that was his natural color or if it was accumulated dirt. His arms and cheekbones were thin, making his bones visible under his skin. His head was bowed, and his eyes were fixed on the ground. The children were scared and started discussing what to do. They didn't know whether to call an adult or just leave and come back later. While they were talking among themselves, David arrived with a sandwich and a bottle of water in his hands. From a distance, he noticed that the children weren't playing, but he didn't understand why. When he saw the thin, dirty man sitting on the bench, he was even more confused. With his innocence and eternal desire to help, he went into the park and sat next to the man. "You're very thin. Are you hungry? Would you like a sandwich? There's water here too. You can have it if you want," David asked. The man looked at the boy for a long moment. David imagined he must be sleepy since adults often feel very tired on Sunday mornings, and also that he must be very hungry, judging by his physical condition. Without saying anything, the man took the water, took a sip, and then took the sandwich and began eating slowly. From a distance, some children ran home, while others stayed, watching, torn between surprise and fear. David watched the man eat and noticed something was wrong with him. He had never seen anyone in that condition or anyone so quiet. The boy wondered if this man could even speak. Maybe that was his problem. He couldn't speak. After eating the last piece of the sandwich and drinking the last sip of water, the man finally said thank you in a dry, faint voice. So he could talk. That wasn't his problem. Even so, something was wrong. David just couldn't figure out what. Surely, this was someone who needed help. But for the first time, David didn't know how to help. David asked the man's name, and he replied that it was Lewis or Parker. He wasn't sure. David asked where he lived, and the man said it was in a house with yellow bricks, but there was no house of that color in the neighborhood. David asked about the man's family, and all he said was that he hadn't seen his relatives in a long time. The boy kept asking questions, but the answers were all vague. It was the first time he couldn't get to know the person he was talking to, but he was determined to help him. While trying to find a way to understand this man, David heard his mother's voice calling him in a way he had never heard before. Brenda shouted her son's name, saying, "Come here right now." Scared, David ran to his mother and tried to say that the man needed help, but she didn't listen. As soon as her son was by her side, Brenda turned her yelling toward the man. "Get out of here and never come back. If you come near my son again, I'll call the police. Get out of—" David froze, frightened and confused. The man heard everything without saying a word. Slowly, he got up and left, always with his head down. Brenda kept shouting until he was gone, then grabbed her son's hand and hurried him back home, almost running. Back home, John and Brenda reacted as any adult would after such a scare and scolded their son. We've explained a million times that you shouldn't talk to strangers. That stranger could have hurt you, or worse, taken you away, and you would never see your parents or friends again. The lecture was long, and David felt heartbroken because he was only trying to help. Still a bit confused, the boy went to his room and stayed there for the rest of the day, both because of his parents' orders and because he no longer felt like playing. That night, Brenda went to her son's room, sat beside him on the bed, and talked more calmly. She explained that they had reacted that way because they loved him more than anything in the world and couldn't even imagine something bad happening to him. She promised that his parents wouldn't talk to him that way again, but that David also needed to do his part and not talk to strangers anymore. The boy listened to everything without responding and only nodded at the end. He asked if anyone else had talked to the man, as he surely needed help. His mother said that some child had called their parents to the park, but when the adults arrived, the man was already gone. Regretfully, Brenda told David that we can't always help everyone, no matter how much we want to. David felt sadder about not being able to help the man than about being scolded by his parents. Even so, he was determined to obey them. After all, they were his greatest inspiration. The next day, without David knowing, John and Brenda had a meeting scheduled at their son's school. The couple let their son enter through the gate, waited a few minutes, and then entered as well. After a moment of waiting in the reception area, they were led to the principal's office. The principal's office had a wooden desk and a cabinet, a single-floor fan, and a large window with blinds, as well as pictures decorating the walls. It was a cozy room, though a bit warm. Principal Sarah greeted them with a polite and formal smile and asked them to sit. She was old enough to be the grandmother of the students at the school, but she maintained her health and composure firmly. She wore a beige blazer, her hair was dyed blonde, and her glasses were elegant. Since it was John and Brenda who had scheduled the meeting, the principal waited for them to speak, though she already had a good idea of what the topic would be. The couple was embarrassed, even a bit fearful. They had fallen behind on their son's tuition and might have to delay it even further. They apologized and promised to pay everything. They were already working extra to support the family and assured that their son's education was their top priority. Sarah listened calmly, understanding that the parents needed to vent and that they wanted to inform her about the tuition delay, so it wouldn't seem like they were disregarding the school. After listening attentively, Sarah reassured them that David was very welcome at the school. However, they already had a generous discount on the tuition, and the school wouldn't be able to renew David's enrollment at the end of the year if all the fees weren't paid. John and Brenda thanked her for understanding, knowing that this was all the school could do for their son. Still, deep inside, they were afraid. They were barely making enough money to pay the bills and had to clear the debt by the end of the year, or they would have to take their son out of the school he loved so much. Meanwhile, unaware of all this, David was studying a few rooms away. The entire neighborhood had heard about the strange man who had appeared in the park. The kids at school were talking about it and treating David differently. If before he was an example of a boy who helped everyone, now they were saying he was irresponsible for talking to a stranger, being used as a bad example by the mothers, and even being avoided by some classmates who used to always want to sit next to him. The school organized a break between classes to talk about safety and the danger of talking to strangers on the street, which made David even more uncomfortable. He even considered hiding in the school bathroom until the end of the day. So great was his desire to simply disappear. He understood that the adults were just thinking about the children's safety, but he was frustrated that no one saw that the man needed help. After all, if people listened to and helped each other more, the world would be a less dangerous place for everyone. A few days later, still that week, there was a knock on David's door. John was alone with his son because Brenda was on duty at one of her patients' houses. The father felt uneasy, as he just wanted some peace after the stressful events of the past few days. When he opened the door, he swallowed hard upon seeing two police officers. The uniformed men greeted John politely and got straight to the point. "We were notified that there was an incident on Sunday. Your son had contact with an unknown man in the park. We need you to tell us everything that happened in detail." John's mind was in turmoil. He knew the whole neighborhood was talking about the incident. After all, several children had also seen the strange man in the park. But if the authorities had been informed and were now asking questions, perhaps that man was dangerous. Maybe he had committed a crime in a nearby neighborhood or was even a fugitive from the police. John asked the officers to come in, offered them coffee, but they only wanted a glass of water. David's father told them everything in detail. Then they asked to question the boy, and John agreed. The officers were kind and patient with the child, asked many questions, and took some notes. John asked why they had come, but the only response was, "We can't provide details about the investigation." The officers thanked the family for their attention and kindness and left. Even though he knew his son was tired of the whole story, John couldn't help but reiterate everything he had already discussed with him. If the police had made a visit, it was because the situation was more serious than everyone had thought. All that was left was to pray that they would never hear from that stranger again, and to be extra cautious when walking the streets. The following weekend, David went to spend Saturday at one of his grandmother's houses, as his parents were working. Anastasia, Brenda's mother, had always been a strict matriarch. She had raised her 4 children with rigidity and discipline, demanded above-average grades, and always taught the importance of hard work. Brenda had always strived to make her mother proud, despite the rare displays of approval from her. Everything changed when Anastasia became a grandmother. Even though she didn't know how to show affection, she loved the company of her grandchildren and indulged their every whim. It wasn't uncommon for Brenda and Anastasia to argue over the excesses of spoiling, but the arguments didn't go far. After all, Brenda wasn't going to start contradicting. Anastasia lived in a spacious apartment with a large living room and 3 bedrooms. Although it was too big for just one person, Anastasia was always visited by one of her 3 children, grandchildren, and even a sister with whom she had always been very close. On the rare occasions when the house was empty, she would take the opportunity to rest, knowing that soon some relative would arrive without prior notice. The building she lived in was also large, with 4 blocks and dozens of apartments. The playground of the building was spacious, with a covered area used as a party room and an open area where the children always played. In addition to a slide and swings, the playground also had a foosball table and a ping pong table. All the children knew David and liked him, despite his rare visits to the building each month. That day, David was playing tag with his friends, winning almost every round. A particularly competitive boy was trying hard to eliminate David and hit the ball too hard, sending it against the playground wall and making it bounce out of the building. While the other children complained, David said, "No problem, I'll go get it," and ran off without waiting for a response. The boy went out the gate, walked around the block, and couldn't believe what he saw. Sitting on the street with his back against a lamppost was the same man from the previous week, even thinner and dirtier, still looking at the ground. David felt a chill in his stomach and froze for a moment. The adults had told him to stay away from strangers and to call the police if he saw that man again. Yet David still felt the urge to help him. While he was thinking, the man looked up and saw David. He didn't do anything, just watched. What could he be thinking? Was he really a dangerous man? Or was he just someone scared? After all, who wasn't afraid? David thought. David had noticed one thing. The adults had made it very clear in recent times that they also felt a lot of fear. Maybe that was the case with that man. David approached, but didn't sit next to him this time. He stayed a few feet away and said good morning without getting a response. "Do you remember me? We met last week. I'm sorry my mom yelled at you. She was just worried about me." But the man remained silent. "Where is your family?" David tried another approach. The man narrowed his eyes and murmured, "Family." David had hopes that he would be able to understand this man, and in doing so, would be able to help him. "Do you have a mom and dad? Maybe a brother or sister? Children?" The man seemed lost in thought, but soon after, his eyes lost their expression, returning to just looking down. David sighed, frustrated that he couldn't help this person. Maybe the adults were right after all. Then David had an idea. Indeed, the adults were right. David couldn't help that man. So there was only one thing left to do. The right thing. David turned around and ran 2 blocks, only stopping to cross the streets. Panting but not out of breath, the boy reached his destination. It was a 3-story building with a gray and black facade, with tall gates and windows. It was the neighborhood police station. More determined than ever, David entered the station, immediately catching the attention of everyone present. The police officers and other staff knew the neighborhood but didn't know David, as he only visited occasionally. A female officer hurried to assist the boy. Her name was Megan, a young woman who had graduated from the police academy less than a year ago and who paid special attention to all cases involving children. Even though she knew that few serious crimes happened in that neighborhood, she couldn't help but imagine dozens of possibilities upon seeing a child entering the station alone. Perhaps this boy's parents or siblings were in danger, or maybe another child had been injured. Hiding her surprise and apprehension, Megan attended to David immediately, saying, "Good morning, how can I help you?" David told her everything, from what happened the previous week to the conversation he had just had with the man. He explained how he had met him, told her about the sandwich, the commotion the story had caused at school, the police visit to his house, and the street where the man was at that exact moment. If the police hurried, he would still be there. But David stressed the whole time that the man hadn't done anything wrong, but rather that he was someone scared and in need of help. The officer was even more surprised and apprehensive and treated the situation with the seriousness it deserved. The police officers made phone calls, searched through some documents, and accessed computer files, comparing the boy's account with the information they already had. The woman assured David that the police would resolve the situation. 3 officers were sent to look for the man, while she herself would accompany David back to his grandmother's house. David insisted on going to see the man because he wanted to help, but the officer didn't allow it. Inside, David was once again frustrated, but he obeyed. He had disobeyed the adults too many times and understood that it was better to follow their instructions, especially a police officer's. Grandma Anastasia was startled when she opened the door and saw her grandson with a police officer, but she quickly calmed down when she heard the account of what had happened. She hugged her grandson and said, "You did the right thing. Come on, I'll get you a bowl of ice cream." That night, when Brenda went to pick up David, Anastasia told her what had happened. She emphasized that David had behaved exemplarily, that he had spoken to the authorities, and that the matter was, once and for all, resolved. Brenda was anxious but happy, both for her son's actions and for the fact that the police had resolved the situation. She didn't know what had happened to that stranger and didn't want to know. All that mattered was that her son was safe. David was glad that the adults were calmer and appreciated the praise he received, but deep inside, he wanted to know what had happened to that man and prayed that he had received the help he needed. The following week seemed to have returned to normal, with no one in the family imagining that their lives were about to change forever. John continued to work as a driver and looked for a job in his field whenever he had time, while Brenda worked 10 or 12 hours a day, and David studied, helped with household chores, and played when on Thursday, there was a knock on the door. John and Brenda exchanged looks and swallowed hard. They didn't want any more surprises. John rubbed his face with his hands, exhausted, and opened the door. "Good evening. Does the family of David live here?" asked a woman in her 50s. She wore a white long-sleeve blouse and a long yellow skirt. "I apologize for coming unannounced. My name is Tanya, and I came as soon as I learned that you were the ones who found my husband." John and Brenda were confused, unable to understand what this woman was talking about. Clearly happy and anxious, she began to explain. Several months ago, Lewis Parker, Tanya's husband, was experiencing severe headaches and decided to go to the hospital. There, the doctor ordered some tests but believed it was unlikely to be anything serious. However, the tests revealed meningitis, and Lewis Parker was immediately hospitalized. The doctor said that if Lewis had waited until the next day to go to the hospital, it would have been too late. The hospitalization period was agonizing because few people survived such a severe illness, and even fewer survived without complications. Fortunately, Lewis Parker managed to recover, but the doctors explained that he would suffer from memory loss for a while. At first, the symptoms were mild. Lewis Parker confused the days of the week and mixed up the names of objects. Lewis, Tanya, and their children took the situation lightly, supporting the man and laughing good-naturedly at some of his word mix-ups. Lewis himself was the one who made the most jokes when he found himself forgetting something. As the days passed, he began to recover until he felt confident enough to walk outside on his own. After months in the early days, he had just walked around the block and said he recognized the streets, even though he couldn't remember their names. Tanya always worried but was happy to see her husband recovering until one day. He went out for a walk and took longer to return. After an hour, Tanya was already frantic, called the police, and drove around the entire neighborhood asking if anyone had seen her husband. It had been a month since Lewis Parker had disappeared, and the police had been searching the entire city for him without success. Tanya herself dedicated her days to finding her husband, distributing notices online, and walking around her neighborhood in hopes of finding him lost between one street and another. She could hardly believe it when she learned that the police had found her husband, and she was even more grateful when she heard it was thanks to a boy. Apparently, everyone in the neighborhood had heard the story of a boy who had given a sandwich to a man on the street who matched Lewis Parker's description, and it wasn't hard for her to find the family. And there she was, personally thanking David for helping Lewis Parker reunite with his family. John and Brenda were stunned. No one had imagined that the strange man in the park was, in fact, someone lost from his family and in need of help. No one except David. Tanya made sure to hear their version of the story and was even more grateful when she got to know those people who had saved her husband's life, especially the kind boy who had wanted to help him from the first moment he saw him. "So young and already an example for all of us," she said after hearing the story and thanking them even more. Tanya announced that her gratitude would not be expressed in words alone. She said, "Your family saved my family, so I must do everything I can to repay you." Lewis Parker needed professional care, especially after spending so many days on the streets. So, Tanya invited Brenda to be Lewis Parker's caregiver. since she already had an elderly mother and aunt. She also assured that Brenda would remain employed even after Lewis Parker had fully recovered. The offered salary was even higher than all the payments Brenda received from the 3 families she worked for, and she wouldn't need to work double shifts or be on call anymore. By coincidence, Lewis Parker was also an engineer, and the company where he worked hadn't fully restructured since he went on medical leave. They certainly needed to hire a new engineer for the team. That same month, John would be returning to work in his field. Finally, Tanya committed to sponsoring David's education until he finished college. It was to him that she owed the greatest gratitude, so nothing would ever be lacking for the boy. The family couldn't believe what was happening and even said they couldn't accept all this, but Tanya was adamant and even said that, in fact, it was all for David. And, of course, the parents wouldn't refuse to have their son's future secured. Indeed, David and his family's lives only changed for the better. Brenda worked at Tanya and Lewis's house for 2 years until Lewis Parker was fully recovered. After that, she began caring for Tanya's mother. John went to work at the same company where Lewis worked and dedicated himself to becoming an indispensable employee, even being promoted within a few months. With the financial improvement, the family was finally able to buy their own home, a 2-bedroom apartment that wasn't luxurious, but was perfect for the family. David's greatest joy was seeing his parents with their own bedroom and the living room separate for meals, for hosting guests, and with plenty of space to play. And David was able to study at the school he loved so much until he graduated from high school, when he passed the college entrance exam in first place and received all his college books as a gift from Tanya and Lewis Parker. The 2 families remained close for the rest of their lives, always helping and strengthening each other. David grew up, and with each passing day, he inspired more people with his humility and eternal desire to help his schoolmates, then his college friends, and later his colleagues at work. Teachers, family members, and close friends all agreed that David was an unforgettable young man and an example of a citizen. Even the older ones learned from him and had their faith in humanity renewed thanks to the boy, who always saw the good in people, regardless of what was seen on the outside. And David never let any praise go to his head. On the contrary, he was inspired by it to become a better person each day. So, did you like the story? We appreciate your company. Don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment below what you thought of the story.